I remember back when Honkai Star Rail first released, I was there on day one, and as I played through Yarilo 6 storyline, I started forming a hypothesis about what these Stellarons actually are. Back then, I hadn't started this channel, and honestly, the idea was little more than a hunch, lacking any hard evidence. And honestly, it seemed pretty far-fetched. But now with the reveals in version 3.8, I think that hunch has graduated into a full-fledged theory. Whether it turns out to be canon or not, it allows us to explore some fascinating philosophical ideas, so I would like to share with all you guys. A quick warning though, we are going to dive deep into full spoilers for Penacony and the version 3.8 storyline. I highly recommend that you experience the 2.x and 3.8 arcs before watching this video. Also, if you haven't seen my previous videos on Acheron, Aventurin, and Sunday, those will provide a good foundation, though they are not strictly necessary to understand this video. So, when I said the hypothesis was about what Stellarons are, I don't mean lore-wise. I'm not claiming that I guessed back then that they were creations of Shippei the Harmony. If I remember correctly, Shippei didn't have a prominent role in the story back then. No, I meant it in a philosophical sense, because this game is a game of philosophy. Every Aeon represents a philosophical idea. So what do the Stellarons represent, philosophically speaking? To put it simply, the Stellarons are postmodernist thoughts. Initially, this was just an intuition triggered by Kokolia's description of the Stellarons' ability to grant wishes and the apparent price you need to pay.
There is a price to pay for new life, wiping away every decaying vestige of the old world, renouncing the meaningless and lingering struggle. This is the price Stellaron demands.
The Stellaron wipes away a past destined for ruin and promises a different future. But notice that at that specific point in time that we visited Yarilo 6, we didn't see a bright new world. Instead, we see a chaotic, fragmented reality.
Don't let its fragmented appearance fool you, Branya. On the day the promise is fulfilled, these ruins will become the breeding ground of a new world.
To me, the language used here immediately links to a key pillar of postmodernism, the deconstructionism. Originally, it was proposed by Jacques Derrida for text analysis, but later, deconstructionism expanded into exposing the internal instability in the binary oppositions we employ to understand objective reality. You see, we traditionally perceive the world through binaries: light versus dark, wisdom versus ignorance, good versus evil. But this dichotomy is an oversimplification. Derrida's point wasn't just that these concepts are hard to define, or that they exist on a spectrum, though that is true, but his point was about our perception and value judgment. We assume that light is good only because we presupposed the dark as the enemy. We value wisdom, but when someone else outsmarts us, we call it a cunning trickery. Even the simple moral judgment of good and evil is fluid, shifting widely across time and culture. This framework explains the link between the Stellarons and the path of destruction. Originally, the Astral Express crew speculated that the Stellarons were creations of the Nuke, the Destruction. But now we know it is not true. In fact, Stellarons are creations of Shippei, because there is a subtle difference here. Deconstructionism did not set out for the destruction of structure. It simply points out that any seemingly solid binaries, for example, order versus chaos, truth versus falsehood, they contain their own contradictions within, and therefore, these structures are castles built on quicksand. Deconstructionism simply predicts their inevitable downfall. However, once these contradictions are exposed by deconstructionism and everyone gets to see them, the conflict intensifies, accelerating that decline. Cocolia mentions the decaying vestige of the old world. The Stellaron didn't cause that decay. The world was already decaying. The Stellaron simply amplified the internal tension that the civilization had accumulated, causing the bubble to burst. Because remember, the eternal freeze wasn't the reason the architects built Belobog. Au contraire, it was the result of it. The people of Jarilo 6 built Belobog in the hope to preserve their home at all costs, and the Stellaron answered that wish. Belobog was already walking a path of self-isolation. The Stellaron just gave it a further push. This is why the Stellaron and the Antimatter Legion aren't really on the same team. In fact, if you think about it, the Eternal Freeze actually stalled the Legion's advance. Deconstructionism and destruction are similar, but not identical. Destruction wipes out existence, deconstruction doesn't. It reinterprets it. To the existing structure, it functions the same as destruction, but it is not a tool forged for destruction, and it is not perpetuated by destruction. You could say, destruction is an inevitable byproduct of the Stellaron's function. Note that I'm not saying the path of destruction is a product of the Stellarons either, but there is a correlation between the two. To put things into perspective, if the Stellaron is a flower, destruction is a bee. The bee isn't created by the flower, but it is irresistibly drawn to its nectar. To an outside observer, they always appear together, implying a connection, but the causality is more nuanced than a simple cause and effect. So what exactly is postmodernism trying to destroy with deconstructionism? You might say, well, it's obvious, it's modernism, right? And you'd be half right. But postmodernism isn't just anti-modernism. It is an attempt to transcend the overarching framework that modernism is built upon. But there are many schools of thoughts other than modernism that are built upon the same framework, and honestly, postmodernism is anti all of them. It singles out modernism in the name simply because it is the most representative and most influential in the modern society. So if you look at the history of Western philosophy, it more or less resembles a series of binary negations. Modernism was born upon the foundation of the Enlightenment against the backdrop of medieval Christian theology. It tells us that this world does not belong to God, it belongs to humankind, and it is both possible and important for us human beings to employ our own reason to solve our own problems instead of relying on divine providence. Its methodology is what we now know as the scientific method. Science helps us understand the world and to some extent, and actually to a wider and wider extent, helps us change the world. To the eyes of the thinkers at that time, it must have seemed like a total rejection of traditional theology, that they are standing on a polar opposite of Christianity. But along comes postmodernism that says, not really. According to postmodernism, modernism inherited the structural framework of Christian theology. Theology says there is a fundamental truth created by God, and we approach it with faith and prayers. Whereas modernism says there is a fundamental truth dictated by the laws of nature, and we approach it using the scientific method. This thinking goes all the way back to Plato, who believed in a universal, unchanging logos, which is more or less reason, which we human beings all have access to, just to a varying degree. Postmodernism calls this pattern of thinking a grand narrative, or meta-narrative. A grand narrative is the belief in something that is transcendental, both universal and timeless. It doesn't have to be a fundamental truth, it could also be a supreme value. For example, Romanticism shifts the supreme value from the faith to God to the love of mankind. But still, there is a supreme value. Or it could also be a prediction of the future. Capitalism is pushing for the increase in productivity, whereas communism promotes cooperation and sharing, but neither of them denies that progress is necessary and even inevitable. Postmodernism seeks to break out of this paradigm entirely, leading to the destruction of these chains on people's thoughts. But you see, this destruction is radical. Accepting postmodernism means accepting that concepts we instinctively feel are good, like truth, love, and progress, are not inherently good. And worse still, it means accepting that concepts like falsehood, indifference, and stagnation aren't inherently bad. You see how counterintuitive it is, and from there you can imagine the catastrophe if and when the values holding society together suddenly evaporated. That is the disaster the Stellarons bring. It doesn't burn the world down, it erases the grand narrative that gave everyone their meaning and place, and leaves the society fragmented. Before Yarelo 6, we knew very little about Stellarons, but we knew they create the fragmentums. The choice of word here is a dead giveaway when you put two and two together. Fragmentation is the fundamental state left behind when postmodernism deconstructs modernism. In the postmodern view, truth and the possession of truth, or knowledge, are just grand narratives that we collectively subscribe to. They are only a set of beliefs about how the world ought to be. And when cultures collide and ideas exchange, these grand narratives crack. Let's say you grow up in an isolated village where everyone accepts the truth that men hunt and women cook. You'd never even question it. It would intuitively seem like that's how the world ought to be. But if you move to another village where women hunt and men cook, you experience a cultural shock. And then, when you calm down a little bit, you start to ask yourself, why? And once you start to ask that why, the grand narrative of gender roles begins to collapse. And the thing is, once these destructive thoughts appear, they are not settling down. They will haunt you forever, even if you immediately go back to your hometown and close yourself off. That's why they say the Stellarons are impossible to destroy and can only be contained.
It's virtually impossible to destroy a Stellaron. No one, not even Herda, has found a way to break its structure. The best we can do at this stage is to prevent its energy from overflowing.
Because once these suspicions and incredulity towards the grand narrative take root in you, there is no way to go back to the peaceful old days of how the world ought to be. The most you can do is not to talk to anyone about it, containing the heretical curse to yourself. So anyway, when the grand narrative collapses, what is left? In the word of the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, who defined the postmodern condition, we are left with little narratives. A very intuitive name. Each of these little narratives is limited to the confines of those who subscribe to them. And every day we are playing language games with these little narratives, a concept he borrowed from Wittgenstein. Therefore, the society becomes more and more fragmented. Lyotard is not trying to criticize this fragmentation, he's only trying to observe and state an objective fact, that this fragmentation is a tendency brought about by the flaws of modernism and modern science and technology. So the real question is, how do we deal with this fragmentation? Lyotard identified two ways people try to cope with this condition, and interestingly, these two correspond exactly to the antagonists in the Pantagonic arc. First, let's look at the concept of consensus, championed by Jürgen Habermas. Lyotard refers to this as the meta-narrative of emancipation. Well, emancipation sounds wonderful, but it doesn't change its nature as a meta-narrative. If you watched my video on Sunday, you know I described his actions as establishing a Platonic foundational myth, which in postmodern terms is a grand narrative. Sunday seeks to wrest authority from the aeons to create a paradise belonging solely to humankind, and to achieve this, he must construct his own order. Through this order, he conducts a symphony where every individual is like a musical note, fixed in their specific place, finding meaning only through their dedication for the collective and the order itself. Under the guidance of his baton, everyone reaches a consensus, performing a flawless, beautiful dream. On the surface, this appears to be a form of emancipation, saving people from suffering and all. However, Lyotard argues that its nature as a grand narrative makes such an act a form of totalitarian terror. It forces every note to exist only in its assigned position and play its assigned pitch, forbidding them from being anything else. Thus, this liberation is a form of self-deception. Even if Sunday has no intention to resurrect another order, or ascend to godhood himself, his success would yield the exact same result because ultimately it remains a grand narrative. The second path Lyotard criticized concerns social system theory, championed by Nicolas Luhmann. Lyotard argues that Luhmann's theory treats performativity as the highest value. In this framework, knowledge is judged not by whether it aligns with the truth, because truth may not even exist, but by a more practical standard, whether it helps the system function as a whole, and that means maximizing output while minimizing input. While this does move away from grand narratives to an extent, it carries its own set of problems. Lyotard views this approach as dehumanizing. It turns living human beings into machine parts existing solely for the sake of efficiency. Under this logic, I should do what I am good at, regardless of whether I enjoy it. It isn't hard to see that in Penacony, this corresponds to the IPC, with its constant drive for cost reduction and efficiency gains, where employees are treated as mere cogs in a massive machine. On a side note, I'm referring to the IPC's institutional ideology, not necessarily Aventuring's personal philosophy. Aventuring is actually quite postmodern. He is the face of the IPC in Penacony, not the mastermind. For a discussion on Aventuring, you can check my previous video. On a side note, I must clarify the term performativity. Lyotard's critique might give people the impression that Luhmann's performativity refers purely to industrial productivity. This is incorrect. Luhmann does not believe productivity is the only supreme value. He views society as a system composed of many subsystems, each with its own independent logic. For the market system, productivity is indeed fundamental, but for other subsystems like science, truth remains the supreme value. In this sense, you see how pragmatic this guy is. He doesn't care how the subsystems operate, as long as the system as a whole can perform. His requirement for these subsystems is simply that they make the overall system perform better. This is the performativity Luhmann champions. Lyotard's critique still holds though, because placing systemic performativity at the center is indeed dehumanizing, and this is the primary distinction between Luhmann and traditional pragmatism, which is quite humanistic. So we're done with the side notes, and this brings us back to the bigger problem with Luhmann's framework, that this mindset only partially escapes grand narratives. You see, the IPC still relies on the divine power of Qliphoth, the preservation. Actually, ever since the game's launch, players have been wondering why the IPC is a faction of Qliphoth. What do a bunch of corporate suits have to do with the preservation? Furthermore, the preservation usually seeks to isolate civilizations from one another. This is logical. As we discussed, cross-cultural exchange increases the likelihood of postmodern thoughts taking root. And once those thoughts take hold, they subvert existing structures and plunge civilizations into turmoil, the antithesis of preservation. However, the IPC has carved out a different path for preservation. Corresponding to the real-world capitalism, they follow Luhmann's path. They are preserving the last bastion of modernism. By abandoning the search for truth in favor of pragmatism, they no longer fear cross-cultural exchange. They can even actively promote it. They can do this because they preserve the final grand narrative that is almost impossible to shake through cultural preferences: the necessity and inevitability of progress. Or as Luhmann puts it, the increase of systemic performativity. Technology improves lives, To be backward is to be vulnerable. Every modern nation in the real world subscribes to this framework, with no exception. But do development and progress truly bring only joy and happiness? Take smartphones. The ability to communicate across the globe has vastly increased social performativity, yet it has also chained us to our devices, answering work calls at all hours, being robbed of our personal time, and living in a state of permanent burnout. This is the dehumanization Leotard warned us about. In the version 3.8 plot, it was revealed that when Dream Master used the Stellaron to respond to Firefly's wish in order to recreate the swarm disaster and use fear to activate people's longing for order, the IPC was secretly positioning itself to usurp the dreamer's desires and expand the influence of the preservation.
However, when faced with the terror of the swarm disaster, how is calling for the preservation any different from calling for the order? The release of the Cornerstone's powers will absorb the Dreamer's desires and offer them the preservation's promise instead, guiding them to cry out these words: all for the Amber Lord.
The Stellaron created the disaster. The disaster bred fear, and in that fear, people saw how fragmented their society and civilization were, leading them to crave unity. Sunday and the IPC each offered them a grand narrative to return them to their pre-disaster state. This is not what the Harmony wishes to see. Thus, Shipe the Harmony glanced at the Trailblazer, giving us the power to defeat Sunday and thwart the IPC's plans. By returning Penacony to a people who have reclaimed their freedom, the Harmony achieved its true goal through Stellaron. The idea of Stellarons being creations of the Harmony seems paradoxical at first, but it's actually very logical. The Harmony is, by its definition, the inclusion of difference, where the prerequisite is that the subjects involved are actually different. If there is no difference, or not enough of it, difference must be created. By using postmodern thoughts to destroy a civilization's existing grand narratives, one creates and expands fragmentation, providing a breeding ground for the Harmony to grow. Actually, there is a theory on HoYoLab suggesting the Stellarons are the divine remains of Anna the Order, absorbed by the Harmony. While I haven't found in-game text to support this, it is a brilliant concept. A modernist grand narrative is the embodiment of order. What better symbol for postmodernism than the corpse of a dead order? However, the Stellaron do not inevitably lead a civilization to harmony, because postmodernism is a process of deconstruction without reconstruction. Postmodern thinkers all agree that modernism must go, but they differ on where civilization should direct itself in this postmodern condition. This is perfectly reflected in the gameplay, by the way. The Trailblazer can switch paths. Currently, the only characters with multiple paths are members of the Astral Express, followers of the Trailblaze. And think about it, the Stellarons use the power of postmodernism to shatter grand narratives, bringing infinite possibilities to the cosmos. Interestingly, this creates the very prerequisites for Trailblaze. Only in a cosmos full of possibilities can the Express's mission be realized: to explore, to understand, to establish, and to connect. Narratively speaking, we don't know why Akvili fell, but philosophically I suspect it had to do with the structural rigidity brought about by grand narratives. The reason the Express could restart the journey may be thanks to the appearance of Stellarons. The Stellaron in us helps us break the rules that are made to be broken, returning us to a state of childlike purity. But it will not and cannot tell us how to walk the path ahead. Postmodernism often falls into absolute relativism. Everyone is right, except for modernism, of course. As long as you don't force a structure, you can do whatever you want. Regarding how one should live, existentialism says you must give your own life meaning. And postmodernism criticizes this, arguing that the requirement to give your life meaning in itself is a grand narrative. You could just easily choose not to seek meaning. By dissolving existing structures and the necessity of meaning, postmodernism also dissolves all responsibility. Therefore, while it creates a possibility for harmony, many other paths benefit as well. The most obvious one is hedonism. If existence has no meaning and I have no responsibility to find it, why suffer to achieve value? Why not just be a masked fool? Faced with the void left behind by the collapsed grand narratives, humanity has two ways to save themselves. One is Acheron's existentialism, and the other is Sparkle's hedonism. I believe this is why the Trailblazers' next stop is a world of elation, Planacadia, where we will definitely witness exactly where the path of hedonism leads. Anyway, that concludes the video. Some people have asked me why I haven't posted anything during the Amphorius arc. Is it because I dislike the story? Well, that is not the case. I have just been very busy with my day job, which has become more and more taxing due to the grand narrative of progress. Furthermore, the plot of Amphorius is incredibly complex. Philosophical analysis isn't the same as plot prediction. As Hegel said, the awe of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. Now that the dusk have fallen and the journey in Amphorius has concluded, I believe that while the story is a bit bloated, mostly to fit in gacha characters, its core ideas, especially regarding Cyrene, Evernight, Fuli, and the Garden of Recollection, reflect a profound understanding of Buddhism, specifically Yogacara philosophy, which is a Buddhist school of thought that asserts that consciousness is all that there is. Moreover, I have no doubt that the writers of HSR are a group of existentialists. The plot of Amphorius doesn't strictly follow Yogacara thoughts. Instead, at a key juncture, it pivots to another direction and offers existential comments on Yogacara and Buddhism. This means I need more time and effort to compile all these fragmented thoughts, into a coherent presentation. But I do plan to talk about it soon, and not just because I love Cyrene. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video and hope it helped you enjoy this wonderful game even more. Until next time.